Now we turn to the career of Raphael. Raphael is was an artist that was very young in getting his start as an independent artist, and sadly also very young when he died. He was born around 1483 and dies in 1520. So it's a pretty short span of time that he works, and yet he leaves truly an indelible mark on the Renaissance and art that comes after it for centuries. What is it about Raphael that has such an impact? I think it's the perfection of Raphael. Raphael is truly an incredible painter and deeply interested in color and perfect compositions, and he's less concerned with some of the things that Leonardo and Michelangelo were of um, intense emotion or um, intertwined, struggling bodies and that sort of thing. In Raphael, there's this stillness, this um, calm, and that's paired with these absolutely beautiful, idealized figures and this gorgeous sense of color that he has. So I think that has a lot to do with it. Raphael was raised at the court of Urbino, a place that was renowned in the 15th and 16th centuries as a place of great learning. There was a Duke of Urbino that brought together scholars and artists, all sorts of men of learning, together at his court. So it's a really cosmopolitan court in Urbino. And Raphael had an easy entry into court life because his father Giovanni had also been a painter at the court. So Raphael is exposed early on to these philosophies and writings of, of that really were marking this humanist trend in Renaissance life. And that certainly had a great impact on him, as did the knowledge about court manners, the way that you behave at court. And he is known throughout his life as someone that was very easy to get along with. Patrons respected him. They treated him as if on par with them, or close to it anyway. And that was quite unusual. He was very well spoken, knew all the right manners, and all of that kind of expectations for behavior. On top of that, he was renowned as being a very good-looking guy. And so people enjoyed having him around because he was easy on the eyes. One place that, one particular source that Raphael would have known and dealt with court manners was this man, Baldassare Castiglione, who wrote a sort of guidebook for courtly behavior called The Courtier. And it is enormously influential and kind of prescribes what behavior should be like at court, the kinds of conversations that should be had, the behavior of men towards women, and the presence of women at the court. All of these things are discussed in this book, and certainly Raphael knew Castiglione well, and in fact even does this portrait of Castiglione that you see here. So that impact on Raphael is important. After spending time in Urbino and working with a painter, Pietro Perugino, who was well known as a great painter, especially the later 15th century, Raphael makes his way to Florence, and there he finds the perfect niche for himself, at least for a while. Because Michelangelo is only there for a short time, a short overlap with Raphael, and Leonardo had already basically one foot out the door, Raphael would soon find himself as the only major artist, still a kid, but a kid with great talent, and one that could fill this market for small devotional pictures in particular. And he does a great number of those as he resides in Florence. We're seeing one of them on the right here. Michelangelo had done this painting of the Doni Tondo, which we've seen already, for Agnolo Doni and his wife Maddalena Strozzi. And it is a painting that was a devotional painting to be placed in a private residence. And that's exactly the kind of function that Raphael's Madonna with Child would have had. People wanted these devotional pictures because, well, they served several purposes. Certainly they were meant to inspire you to pray, but they were also viewed as means of reminders of appropriate behavior. Women were meant to look at these images of the Virgin Mary and see her as a model of motherhood. Children were meant to look at these paintings of the young Christ and his cousin John the Baptist, patron saint of Florence, who we've seen appears in the Michelangelo painting as well, and view them as models for the way children should behave, and they should strive for holy life in the same way that was lived, obviously, by Christ and St. John the Baptist and by other saints, which were often the source of imagery for private devotional images as well. In this Raphael, you can see that he is influenced by these approaches to composition that you see in both Michelangelo and absolutely in Leonardo's work, where there is this pyramid, and in Raphael's you can really just draw exactly out where that pyramid is, and it really stabilizes the composition. Leonardo had done a similar thing in another work we looked at, which was the Madonna of the Rocks. Totally pyramidal composition. It gives it that sense of absolute harmony and stability, and then Raphael fills that pyramid with these absolute idealized beauties. And as I said, there's this kind of sweetness and calmness about Raphael's work, which you can certainly see represented here, as well as his sense of color, which is just beautiful. And he often uses what we call color patterning, where you see the same color appear in various areas of the composition so that it really melds everything together and makes it harmonious. We see that as well in this really beautiful painting, the Madonna del Prato, where we have, again, a pyramidal composition. We have the same figures that we saw in La Belle Jardinière. We have the figure St. John the Baptist and the Christ child, and they are in this perfect landscape setting. This is, you don't see storms coming in. You don't have any sense of inquietude in this place. It is still and beautiful and perfect. And you can really understand how this was meant to work as a source of a model for emulation. Those compositional strategies that we see in Raphael are certainly indebted to Leonardo, as I've already mentioned. And there was a cartoon in particular, this one, St. Anne the Virgin and Child, and actually John the Baptist is included here as well. And that kind of sense of the composition, using these pyramids, thinking about the composition in terms of geometric shapes, is something that Raphael is very much influenced by. And with Raphael, he takes that sense of geometry and perfect shapes to how he treats the figure, whereas Leonardo was doing dissections and really working out exactly how the figure moves and works and the way bone structure is and why that is. Raphael's not interested in that, and he approaches the figure instead in terms of a series of geometric shapes, ovals in particular, but you can see spheres. Everything is very much about how various perfect geometrical entities can be interwoven and form these ideal figures. So it's not about study of human anatomy, it's all idealized. Raphael works for some of the same patrons that Michelangelo worked for. This is a pair of portraits that he did for Agnolo Doni, who we see here on our left, and his wife, Maddalena Strozzi, who we saw were the patrons of Michelangelo's Doni Tondo. And we can see here certainly that continued influence of Leonardo's work. Obviously, Maddalena Strozzi's portrait is based on Leonardo's Mona Lisa, and though there are striking differences there, with Raphael, we get a much more uniform light. There's some hint at atmospheric perspective, but he's not really interested in showing natural phenomena. It's not really identifiable as a real space that exists, a real landscape. It's more about, maybe looking at nature and then bringing it to a whole absolute level of perfection, right? The clouds are in here, they're perfectly symmetrical, they add to the balance of the composition, they mimic the positioning of the figure. We have her perfectly ovoid head and these unbelievably sloping shoulders that are then mimicked in the landscape. It's not that we have this real looking woman in front of a real looking landscape as we would have in Leonardo, right? It's about the idea of showing perfection. And you can see that especially if you compare the portrait of Maddalena Strozzi with that of Mona Lisa. The format is obviously the same. These are three-quarter length portraits of these women. Their bodies are turned in the same way. Both hands are placed one on top of the other. She's resting her arm on the chair arm. The turn of the head is very much the same. Even the slope of the shoulders, though exaggerated in Maddalena Strozzi, you can see the relationship with the Mona Lisa. On the other hand, Leonardo's is actually an identifiable place. We know exactly where this is. That bridge still exists. The landscape behind it is, there's a sense of cloudiness. We've got that atmospheric haze, but it's all there's this kind of, when you compare it to Raphael's, there's this kind of foreboding tone about Leonardo's work. Raphael's is this perfectly uniform light, happy, bright, sunny day. And, we just don't get that same kind of tone in Leonardo's work. When we see Raphael expressing emotion, if he's charged with doing a composition, a subject matter that requires a show of expression of emotion, it's still really toned down compared to Michelangelo and Leonardo. It's, here we have the figure of Christ who's been taken down from the cross. We see the cross up here. The central cross was the one that Christ was on. He's been taken down. He's been brought down the hillside. And we see as they are preparing to place the body inside of the tomb, which we have back here. So we get a sense of the movement. We can see that this guy is holding the body up with some strain as he makes his way up this rocky little stairscape into the tomb. We have the figure of the Virgin Mary. Poor thing has fainted over here from the shock of what's happening. But we don't have really great sense of desperation and drama. Yes, she has fainted. But, there's, even in the reaction of the women around her, it's not exactly, a high-pitched scene of drama. That's just not what Raphael is interested in. Again, the landscape gives no hint of the drama of this scene. It's this perfect landscape, absolutely idealized. Everything's quite symmetrical, perfectly placed, uniform lighting, bright, happy, sunny day. But we can pinpoint what some of his sources are for the figure, and certainly the figure of Christ is absolutely influenced by Michelangelo's Christ in the Pietà. The same positioning of the legs, for example, the body is turned in a way that's similar. You have the arm hanging down and so forth, so that you see that Raphael is taking from Michelangelo and Leonardo, but he's making it his own. He's really formulating his own style. And it's a style that is much more about harmony, color, um, and this real sense of what Raphael sees as perfection. And it's through that sense of perfection that for Raphael, the divine is expressed. So they're just going about, and they have the same goal of expressing divinity, but they achieve it in very different ways. Their approach is quite different. So Raphael really starts to make a name for himself in Florence, and there's Pope Julius II, who comes from Raphael's hometown of Urbino, and he's obviously situated now in Rome as Pope and is bringing together artists to work on major projects. Julius is very interested in leaving a series of monuments that are identifiably done under his patronage, and certainly it's all it's about the glorification of Rome. The rebuilding of Rome is still an important part of any of these projects. Rome had gone into great disrepair during the 14th century in particular, but that had been going on since the sack of Rome in the 5th century. And so a lot of rebuilding still needed to take place. One of the major projects that Julius will be interested in is the rebuilding of the Church of St. Peter's, an early Christian church that had absolutely fallen into disrepair and was in great need of rebuilding. But first, Julius is interested in planning for his death and making a monument to himself that will be impressive and, in fact, unprecedented in its scale. And he hires Michelangelo to do this project. Michelangelo is keen to do it. He leaves Florence with great anticipation for what he no doubt would see as being, all he could hope for in a sculptural project. It involved architecture. He could pack on as many figures as he wanted. He was given pretty free rein in what he planned initially for this tomb. It was going to be four-sided. You'd be able to circumambulate around it. It would have been really just an incredible tomb, and full of all of these life-size and over-life-size figures. It was just all he could ever hope for, and probably looked like something that he could really spend the next few years doing and make a lot of money off of. He was promised 10,000 scudi to do this project, which was just an enormous sum if you consider that the average worker in Florence made about 2 to 5 scudi a month. So just an enormous amount of money. So Michelangelo goes and is super excited for the promise of this project. But unfortunately for Michelangelo, he starts running into problems pretty early on. He goes through a couple of phases as he's trying to think of various ways to approach this project. This is another design that he comes up with. But all of those designs end up being kind of for naught because there is an architect whose name is Bramante, who, like Julius II and like Raphael, came from Urbino. Bramante had gotten his start in his hometown, but had gone to Milan and met Leonardo there, worked for the Sforza Dukes, and did some impressive monuments of architecture, monuments that were very much inspired by the architecture of antiquity and were about kind of simple, monumental architecture that was rooted in this grandiose ancient Roman architectural idiom in particular. So because of that, because of his fame in Milan and because they came from the same hometown, Julius was eager to bring Bramante to Rome and see what Bramante could do to help with the rebuilding of the city. And Bramante convinced Julius early on that what he should really focus on is the rebuilding of the Basilica of St. Peter's. The Church of St. Peter's had been built by Constantine in the 300s, and it marked the site where St. Peter was buried. It was absolutely the centerpiece for the early Christian church and continued even through the next centuries when it went under a great deal of disrepair to be a major pilgrimage site. Pilgrims came from all over to view the burial site of Christ's closest apostle, Peter. So this looked like the perfect project for Bramante and for Julius to make their name with. And so Julius decides, with Bramante's great encouragement, to put his money into the rebuilding of this project and to halt the project of his tomb. Michelangelo, according to Michelangelo's writings, did not see this coming at all and shows up one day at the Vatican to talk to Julius about his tomb project and is turned away at the door. Michelangelo is so offended, he leaves Rome and, just totally put off by this kind of treatment. And Bramante eagerly starts sketching out new plans for the church. Something that happens, and again, Michelangelo blames Bramante for this, is that the Pope decides, instead of having Michelangelo work on the project of the tomb, to work on another project. And that project is for the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo had left Rome. He was really upset. Julius is busy for a couple of years getting things started with the building of St. Peter's, but also doing things to increase the domain of the Papal States over which he was ruler. One of the areas that he goes into battle with and eventually claims is the city of Bologna. He demands that Michelangelo come to Bologna in 1506, even though Michelangelo doesn't really want to. The Republican ruler of Florence, Soderini, refuses to get involved in battle with Julius for not obeying orders, so he makes Michelangelo go to Bologna and meet up with the Pope there. The Pope demands that Michelangelo make a bronze sculpture of a large bronze sculpture of Julius that would be placed on the cathedral facade. Michelangelo does it very reluctantly because bronze is not a medium that he's ever been comfortable with. He does it with the help of local sculptors who did know how to work bronze, and the sculpture is placed on the facade. I can't show it to you because the next year, when Julius and the papal troops were thrown out of the city by the Bolognese, they take the bronze sculpture from the facade, melt it down, and turn it into a cannon that they called La Giulia after Julius, and they use it to fire cannonballs against the papal troops. So that sculpture has not come down to us. And that fate of bronze sculptures being melted down and used for artillery of various kinds is absolutely not uncommon. So, they didn't care that it was by Michelangelo or that it would potentially be the only bronze to come down to us. They used it because bronze was such a useful and very expensive material to get their hands on. Anyway, once Michelangelo is forced to work for Julius again, Julius says, I've got a project for you. And Michelangelo tells us that it is Bramante's fault that Julius got this idea. Julius demands that Michelangelo paint the ceiling of the chapel that Julius's uncle, who had been a pope, Pope Sixtus, had built. And that chapel is the Sistine Chapel, which you're seeing here from the outside. And during Sixtus's time, the construction of the chapel had taken place, and the side walls of the chapel had been painted, as you can see here, done by artists like Botticelli and by Raphael's teacher Perugino and other artists of note. And the ceiling had been painted in a very traditional way, which was with blue background and gold stars to mimic the heavens. Totally normal kind of decoration for a chapel of the medieval period and even of the 15th century. So when Julius, potentially under Bramante's guidance, decides for Michelangelo to do this chapel, what he demands is for Michelangelo to repaint the ceiling and these areas over the windows and these spaces of the pendentives that are over those archways, right? So he does this whole section from here up and over. And Michelangelo is, what he tells us, but is probably not true, is that he was given free rein to paint whatever he wanted. And what he painted is, of course, one of the works he's most famous for. But Michelangelo bitterly complained the whole time he had to work on this. He complained because he said Bramante wanted him to do this project because Bramante was in cahoots with Raphael, and Michelangelo just really didn't see himself as a painter, and especially a fresco painting. He said he had no experience with it whatsoever, which we know wasn't actually true because he had worked in Ghirlandaio's shop and learned fresco painting there. But it's part of this myth that Michelangelo creates that he didn't receive training, that he's this kind of self-taught artist that is born with this natural genius. And so he, in his biography, he kind of denies, that he had this training with Ghirlandaio or that he had learned sculpture from Bertoldo di Giovanni. These things are just left out. Michelangelo writes poetry while he's working on this ceiling and letters to his friends about how miserable he is, that he wasn't cut out to do this, that he's been forced to do this so that he'll fail, and that then Raphael can just take over the painting scene, and that the Pope won't ever have Michelangelo do the tomb project as he had hoped, and Michelangelo's career will be ruined because this will be such a failure. Needless to say, we don't exactly view this as a failure of Michelangelo's. In fact, it is truly one of the great triumphs of Western painting. What Michelangelo does is create a series of scenes that go through the Old Testament. Specifically, they go through the stories of Genesis, from God's creation, the separation of light from darkness, the creation of the stars and moon and sun and plants, and you keep going through until you get to the creation of man, the creation of woman, and then you keep going back. And what we keep going back to is going towards the moments of the fall of mankind, which took place when Adam and Eve disobeyed God and took from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and then to the nakedness of Noah, when Noah has gotten drunk and is naked, and his sons have to cover him up. And then you have the scene of the flood, where there was so much sin on earth that God decided to flood out humanity, saving only Noah and a few of his family members, and to restart humanity. And there were obvious links that were meant to be made there from the fall of Adam and Eve and the beginning of sin to Noah and the ark and the restart of mankind and the ability of mankind to hopefully live free from sin again. Then that doesn't really hold, and so Christ is sent on earth to redeem mankind's sin once again. So it's all about God and his creation the fall of man, uh, God's intervention in trying to make men free of sin, and then this sort of cyclical nature of that. And we're supposed to be reminded in this space, especially of the potential for resurrection, and in that way that we should obviously strive for a life free from sin, and that partaking in the Eucharist, symbolic of the sacrifice of God's Son, is a way that we can attain a sinless existence, even if just for a while, right? So that's basically what the ceiling is about, or better, that's what the main section of the ceiling is, the central scene. The figures along the sides are the ancestors of Christ, and that's actually who we see down here in these areas over the roundels over the windows and in the pendentas. And then we see in this area the prophets and sibyls that foretold the coming of Christ. Right? So there's this obvious connection made between the events of the Old Testament and the coming of Christ, and that kind of typology of Old Testament and New Testament is something that we see from the early Christian period on. That kind of typology is further seen in the side walls, where you have the life of Christ on one side and the Old Testament scenes, in particular scenes from the life of Moses, on the lower walls. So again, these ideas of typologies. So this is the view of the whole central part of the ceiling. So you can see that this is where you have the scene of the drunkenness of Noah. You have the flood with the ark. You've got here the fall of man as they take the fruit from the tree of knowledge and are expelled from the Garden of Eden. Then the creation of Eve, then Adam, and then you have God's creation of the earth and its components. So when you would come into the Sistine Chapel, you would, as a layperson, enter into this part. And so you actually are starting with sin and then working towards redemption as you make your way to the space of the altar, and obviously that movement is significant. You get closer and closer to that time of freedom from sin. And as you make your way then from the space of the altar back, you're reminded of that fall of sin and the propensity for mankind to sin as you prepare to exit into the chapel and go back to real life. And you're supposed to be reminded of how easy it is to fall from sin, but that you need to do what you can to ward off that tendency. So that's one way that we're meant to read this ceiling. But the clergy in particular, keeping in mind that this chapel was the Pope's personal private chapel, and that the College of Cardinals would meet here and continues to meet here when they elect a pope and for other important decisions. They would meet in this space, and there's a screen down on the ground floor of this chapel that divides off the space. And what we see is that screen delineates that space between the creation and the fall, free from sin and sin. And the clergy would have sat on this side of that choir screen, and clearly those implications about their placement in God's hierarchy are pretty clear. Here's the full thing labeled so that you can see exactly what's being represented here. So as I said, you've got the ancestors that go around here, and in the space of the pendentives. Then you've got the prophets and sibyls, and they alternate. so that these are the ones that foretold the coming of Christ. And then you've got the central scenes. It starts with God dividing light from darkness. God creates the sun and planets, divides the water from the earth, creation of Adam, creation of Eve. Adam and Eve tempted and expelled, from the Garden of Eden. Noah and his family making a sacrifice after the flood, and the drunkenness of Noah. One thing that we can see by studying these individual scenes is that Michelangelo's style changes a great deal as he's working on them. And in fact, we know that he started at this was his first scene. These scenes of Noah were the first scenes that he did, and the figures are tiny. And we see some of the components that were used to sing in Michelangelo's work, lots of nude figures. They are bulky, muscular figures, and we can certainly see some references to ancient sculptures that he would have looked at and been inspired by. But what we see as we compare this treatment of the composition with so many figures and so tiny is that as time went by and as Michelangelo is moving the scaffolding, as he's making his way towards those scenes of the altar, his style changes, his approach to the composition changes a great deal, and the figures get much larger, take up a greater space of the composition, and they're much more simplified compositions. And obviously it's because as he's moving the scaffolding and looking up, he sees that actually it's quite difficult from the ground to be able to read these complex scenes filled with tiny figures. So he simplifies it and makes it so that the figures are more legible. In this scene of the temptation and the fall, you can see that he's divided the composition perfectly in half, with the tree of knowledge here. The tree is in full bloom here. It's this lush tree, and you have Adam here who raises up and seems to be much more a participant than we've often seen him, as he grabs hold of the branch and gestures towards the serpent. Eve, of course, is the one grabbing the fruit, and in terms of the treatment of the figure of Eve, we can see she's this beautiful but very muscular, very strong-looking woman, as is, Adam is certainly very bulky and muscular as well. And we see them looking quite different on the other side of the tree. The serpent here seems to have this kind of spinning circular compositional form, and spins out kind of on the other side with the angel who directs them out of the garden, with a bit of violence, even as the sword is held, showing them which way they have to go. And there's a dramatic difference in the treatment of the figures. If you look at Eve in particular, no longer is she this youthful, beautiful bodied woman. She is old and haggard looking. Her flesh no longer has that tone of the flesh that she had in this moment before sin. And the same can basically be said of Adam, especially in the treatment of the head. We really see the lines of Adam's and Eve's face. And when we looked at the Pietà, I told you that idea of being free from sin means that you don't age. And so their aging here reflects that sin that they've committed. I've mentioned already Michelangelo is influenced by ancient sculptures in particular that he's seeing, and this is one that we know he's particularly influenced by, and it had been uncovered just a few years before he starts working on the Sistine ceiling. And we know, in fact, that Michelangelo was actually present the moment that the sculpture was uncovered. And this is a famous sculpture, though one that is wrought with confusion, because we're not exactly sure who made it or when it was made, whether this is a copy or an original of a Hellenistic sculpture. But it was a sculpture that was described by Pliny, a writer that describes many of the monuments around Rome and Greece, for that matter, and gives us um, a lot of information, and certainly gave Renaissance artists a lot of information about ancient sculpture and architecture, for that matter. But anyway, so Michelangelo was there when it was uncovered and identifies it as a sculpture that Pliny talks about of Laocoon, who is intertwined with a snake, and the snake is in fact eating him and will eat his children. And so a very dramatic scene that's shown here, obviously. But something that Michelangelo is particularly impressed with is the treatment of the figure of Laocoon with this, you know, torsion of the figure, the way the body is turned, twisted, so that the muscular strain can be shown. Michelangelo really loves that. And we see him using some of those ideas in the figures he does in the Sistine ceiling. I should mention that there's even greater confusion about this figure because a few years ago, an art historian argued that, in fact, this was not an ancient sculpture, but is a sculpture by Michelangelo himself, that the whole story of him being there when it was discovered was a little shady, and she argues that, in fact, this is by Michelangelo. I have not seen that accepted in any way in other art historical scholarship, but it's kind of an interesting thought. This is another sculpture that Michelangelo knew, and it has an ancient sculpture that has some of the same characteristics we see in the Laocoon of the twisting, bulky, nude male torso and all of that muscular strain. Obviously, we still find that kind of torsion of the body to be an attractive thing, as it really emphasizes the muscle of the torso, and you can see that in the beautiful David Beckham here. Oops. So one place where we can see Michelangelo's use of this treatment of the torso is in the figures that are part of the framing elements between those major central scenes. These figures are called the ignudi, I-G-N-U-D-I. One is in ignudo. But these little nude males that are framed by garlands and drapery show that treatment of the figure clearly influenced by the torso belvedere and the Laocoon. And you can certainly see that as well in what's probably the most famous scene from the Sistine Chapel, the scene of the creation of Adam. In this, we have the figure of Adam who's been formed from clay. We have God above swooping down, his arm around this figure who appears to be maybe an adolescent female. His fingers touch the shoulder of this big baby here, and then we've got these other figures that are pretty hard to identify and have been, in fact, the source of many an art historical article trying to identify them and figure out the meaning of their presence here. But what is so fabulous, in a way, about this composition is this space right here. And Michelangelo has clearly considered how to really express the dynamism of the scene, this amazing moment of this electrical charge that brings Adam to life, that this life force being transmitted into Adam from God, and how to really picture that exact moment when that has taken place. And, you know, because of the blank space behind their hands as they just barely, are closing in together or have just touched and are moving, starting to move apart, really emphasizes that space, right? It really gives it an even greater visual interest because of how he's composed of that central part of this scene. One of the figures that has been identified in various ways is this figure, this female figure, and even this figure, but I'm not going to say anything more about that, as you'll be talking about this in your online discussion, in your discussion about these figures, based on the articles you'll be reading. This is a scene much closer to the altar, where we have the creation of the sun, the moon, and plants. So things get more and more simplified as we make our way to the high altar. That's true because of the subject matter, but also true because he's really exploring how to give the greatest visual impact to these scenes that will be seen from some distance down on the floor of the chapel. And also, I would point out the innuity that you see here, and we saw this one actually previously, but the way he's really using those figures and exploring the beauty of the male body and using those ancient sources of the Laocoon and the Torso Belvedere. And then the scene of the separation of light from darkness that starts the whole thing. In between the innuity are these medallions, and those medallions have Old Testament stories on them. And I point them out merely to say that there are so many levels of meaning and areas that can be interpreted on the ceiling, from the medallions to the innuity, who, we don't exactly know who they are, to the central figures, the central panels, of course, and the figures on the sides with the ancestors of Christ and with the prophets and sibyls. That it's understandable that this ceiling continues to be a source of so much interpretation and speculation on the part of art historians. I think what really shows this change of style so dramatically is if we look at the two figures that are on each end of the ceiling. On the ceiling, right as you enter into the chapel where you have the scenes of Noah, it starts with this figure of Zechariah, who is this older man, beautifully draped, gorgeous color, looking at a book. You can see he's kind of thumbing through the book. As we get to Jonah, who in many ways foreshadows Christ, we can see that Jonah is shown here with much greater dynamism, and we understand he's leaning back. The figure has been foreshortened. We're not just seeing him sort of floating in front of our eyes as now Zechariah appears to, but he seems to be seated and leaning back. You have much greater dynamism in the figures that are shown with him as compared to these very static figures behind the shoulder of Zechariah. And you've got the sea monster as well, and the sea monster recalling the story of Jonah, who is swallowed up by the whale and spit out, or sea monster, and spit out 3 days later, just as Christ is crucified, buried, and is resurrected after 3 days. One other area I would just point out is this use of colore cangiante, which we see in this burgundy that turns to green, that turns back to burgundy. Artists of this next style that we'll look at, of mannerism, will be very much influenced by Michelangelo's use of colore cangiante, so you should keep that in mind. Some of the lovely figures of the sibyls on the side. This is an earlier sibyl, a beautiful figure, very muscular figure, who is reaching back, holding up this gigantic book, and she's twisted around And, we can see that she's probably getting ready to turn that book and place it on her lap, or maybe she's gone in the other direction. But very muscular back she's got on her here. And it's true that Michelangelo is using male models for any of his depictions of women. And he basically just kind of adds on whatever is necessary, whatever is necessary to make this female enough. But the masculinity of these figures has been interpreted, as some of you will read about, as being his way to communicate the intellectual strength and the virtue of these sibyls who foretold the coming of Christ. And those are attributes. Intelligence, in particular, was an attribute associated with masculinity in the Renaissance, and so he's communicating that through the way that their bodies are treated here. The other thing I would mention as we look at the Sistine is the dramatic change that took place when the ceiling was cleaned in the 90s, and layers of dirt and smog and smoke were finally taken off and revealed the true brilliance of the colors on the ceiling. This was a very controversial restoration campaign. Some were afraid that we were taking off all the protective layers from the ceiling, and that could in part be true, but it certainly allowed us to see Michelangelo's work the way it was meant to be seen, without all of this darkness and obscured color. And we had just completely misinterpreted the ceiling before, and you can see this is the way that it looked before, so brown and kind of dreary, even monochromatic color scheme. And that is totally different than the way we see the ceiling now. So while previous art historians talked about this being Michelangelo's palette, we can see that that wasn't true at all. In fact, his palette was quite brilliant. And that is where we will end for now, and we'll pick up next time with Bramante.